All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the June edition of Real Space Strategy Live. I am your host, Christopher Stone, Senior Fellow for Space Deterrence here at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies in Washington, D.C. And today is a pretty awesome episode we got for you today. We have a special guest, a guy that I've had the privilege of working with on a few projects in the past, with his former employee and some other places that he's worked before, Dr. Kevin Pollpeter. Currently with the U.S. Air Force's China Aerospace Studies Institute. They obviously have a couple of locations, and he will give a little bit of background on that when we get to his presentation. Just a couple of reminders. When we get to the Q&A section, which will probably be around the bottom of the hour, make sure that you type all of them in the chat. We do chat questions in this forum. And if you are a member of the press, please let us know what your affiliation is so we can make sure we give you the credit that is due to you. And then also, if you are a senior person in a government, feel free to let us know that as well. So welcome everybody for that. Also, I would like to just mention that we do have a bunch of resources for you with those of you that are interested in deterrence studies. Obviously, we have our website, thinkdeterrence.com. That is thinkdeterrence.com. And then we also have a presence on most of the social media avenues, such as LinkedIn and things of that sort. So feel free to look for that. But for now, we're going to go ahead and bring up the presentation for Dr. Pollpeter. And I'm just going to go ahead and just say thank you very much, Kevin, for being here.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for having me. Yeah, you did mention that I'm affiliated or now employed by the China Aerospace Studies Institute. So while the slides are brought up, let me give just a brief introduction to what we do at CASI. So we are part of the Air University. We serve both the Air Force and the Space Force. And our mandate really is if China flies it, we study it. So that includes aviation, both crewed and uncrewed, space, ballistic missiles. We go into a little bit of cyber and AI and even nuclear issues, as well as the personnel issues, concepts of deployment, industrial base issues all surrounding that. So we have a pretty wide mandate. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about deterring China's use of force in the space domain. This was actually a project that I started when I was at the Center for Naval Analysis and finished up here when at CASI. So I also have to reach out, even though they're not here today, April Herlevy and Elizabeth Barrett, who are my former CNA colleagues who participated in this study. So I have to say, since I am now a U.S. Air Force employee, that all the opinions, conclusions, and recommendations expressed or implied during this presentation are solely those of me and do not necessarily represent the views of the Air University, the Department of the Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other U.S. government agency. Okay, so let's get on with it here. So we were asked to look at, is it possible to deter China from attacking U.S. space assets in the space domain? Before I sort of start in with that, let me talk briefly about at least how I view PRC views of military space. Kimberly, if you could advance the slide, please. Okay, there we go. So almost every book or major article that you read written by PRC analysts, you will somewhere see at the beginning that whoever controls space will control the Earth. Okay, so there's this real sense that controlling what's happening out in outer space will determine what's happening on the terrestrial battlefield. And you can see in Chinese official writings that actually they place a great deal of emphasis on space. That the 2015 Defense White Paper put out by China states that outer space has become a commanding height in international strategic competition. and it identified space as one of 4 critical security domains, along with maritime, cyber, and nuclear. And the reason why they say that is because they say that space is the most important component of a modern military's information systems. Now, when they're looking at how the U.S. uses space, this is not my analysis, this is the PRC analysis. They say that the U.S. uses space for 70 to 80% of our ISR capabilities, and that we use space for 80% of our communications. So they're looking at that and they say, hey, we want some of that, right? So they see how powerful space has made the US military. On the other hand, they also see how dependent we are on space, and they view this as a key vulnerability or an Achilles heel. But overall, they say that looking at the way the US military has conducted operations since the 1991 Gulf War, they have determined that without space, conducting modern war is not possible. And so what you see in PRC writings is that they say that space power will develop like air power has. So you think about World War I, you have biplanes flying over the trenches, taking pictures. Then somebody got the idea of bringing a rifle up into one of the planes to shoot at the other guy. Then we mounted machine guns on them. And now we have B-2 bombers flying around the globe conducting strategic bombing, right? So they see space power going through the same evolution. We are more or less sort of in that biplane flying over the trenches, taking pictures part of the evolution. But eventually what will happen is that in order to deny those capabilities, we'll see space warfare develop, even up to and including bombardment from space. So the overall goal here then is to achieve space superiority, which PRC analysts define as the ability to freely use space and deny space to adversaries. Next slide, please. And so I just want to focus real quickly, since this is probably the main part of the topic today, are counterspace related activities that China has been performing or developing. So the first is direct descent kinetic kill vehicle technologies. So in 2007, China destroyed an alien or an aging weather satellite, right? The debris is still up there. And then in 2013, they conducted another test almost all the way up to GEO. And in between then, they've conducted a number of other tests, many of which they have stated are more missile defense related, but with obvious counterspace related implications. China is also developing directed energy weapons. Right now, they have lasers that can dazzle or temporarily blind sensors. They are said to be working on high-powered lasers that will be able to degrade or actually disable satellites. We've seen China implicated in a number of cyber attacks against space assets, including the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as a number of Asian-based satellite communication providers. China is also heavily involved in electronic warfare, looking at jamming GPS and satellite communications, as well as also developing co-orbital capabilities. So in 2022, the most famous example is where the SJ-21 satellite went and grabbed a defunct Chinese Beidou satellite navigation satellite and towed it up into a graveyard orbit. The implication being that if China can do that to one of its own satellites, it could do it to an adversary satellites. Sort of to sum this all up, China is developing basically a robust suite of counter space capabilities that I like to say is designed to threaten U.S. space capabilities from the ground all the way up to geosynchronous orbit. Next slide, please. So then let's get into really the meat of what we're talking about today. And as I said before, the simple question that was presented to us was, is it possible to deter China from attacking U.S. assets in the space domain? And so to begin off, let's talk a little bit, get our bearings here and talk a little bit about deterrence and space deterrence. We define, for the purposes of the report, deterrence as a form of coercion that attempts to convince an adversary not to take a certain action. It involves capabilities, right? You need some sort of maybe technological ability to actually do that coercion. You need the will to use it, and then you need some sort of communication or signaling to communicate to the other side that you both have the capabilities and will. And then for the purposes of the report, we define space deterrence as dissuading another country from interfering with systems that operate in space or support the operation of space systems from the ground. Okay, next slide, please. So our approach in addressing this problem was we wanted to go back and take a look at as much of the literature as possible that had been written on deterrence. So we went all the way back and read some of the classic deterrence literature from the first Cold War, and then we moved on up to some more of the more modern treatments of deterrence. And of course, during the Cold War, a lot of that literature was focused on nuclear weapons. The more contemporary literature now is focused more generally on deterrence in general. And what we found, though, was that there seems to be a growing opinion that deterrence is becoming less effective. We have new challengers, China, of course, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that seek to challenge the U.S. politically and militarily, are less inhibited in doing so, and are developing the weapons and the tactics that attempt to exploit asymmetries with the U.S. And we see that, of course, especially in the case of China. China is now our pacing threat, right? And we can see that with their development of counterspace weapons. A second factor that may make deterrence less effective is that really we haven't seen really a full-fledged space war, right? Counterspace weapons have not been fully tested in combat operations. There's been some activity here and there, but we really haven't seen a full-blown space war. And so this could give rise, so in the absence of that, it could give rise to differing beliefs about the use, risk, and effectiveness of counterspace weapons that may lead some countries to believe that maybe they could use these weapons effectively against the United States. And then finally, there's a lack of international engagement on the issue. It's not like during the Cold War when the United States and the Soviet Union actually had extensive contacts talking about strategic deterrence. We actually engaged in nuclear arms control. Today, as you see it across the board with China, right, on almost any issue is a lack of negotiations, public statements, signaling, or weapons acquisitions that are intended to shape perceptions and understanding of each other's policies. So combined, there's sort of this feeling that maybe deterrence is becoming less effective than before. Next slide, please. And also looking at the deterrence literature, we found that actually there are a lot of case studies which point out that deterrence actually fails in practice. And a lot of this boils down to humans are not rational actors, believe it or not. Doesn't mean we're crazy. It just means that when we're making decisions, whether it's about regular daily household issues or going to war, humans don't really sit down and do a cost-benefit analysis, figuring out the advantages, disadvantages, sort of weigh those out and say, okay, more more benefits and costs, we can do it. In practicality, humans don't often do that. But then also what you find when you look at the deterrence literature is that there's actually a lot of other factors that leaders weight sort of more important than the military balance. These include internal politics, domestic politics, pride, a leader's worldview, their acceptance of risk, or maybe they're working on incomplete or inaccurate information. An important theory involved with this is called prospect theory. And in that, it says that humans value losses more than gains. And so here, instead of, it states that actually humans will be more upset or will likely fight harder to avoid a loss than to get a gain. So in practical terms, sort of simple everyday terms, it's the reason why we are more unhappy to have lost $10 than we are happy to have found a $10 bill lying on the sidewalk, okay? And so what we find then is that because of this, nations that harbor grievances or highly value honor may be more resistant to deterrence measures. And of course, we have that, I would argue, with China. And so what we see is Ned Lebo, who is a prominent, now retired international relation scientist out of the UK. He writes that the reality of international relations is less ordered, less comprehensible, more contradictory, and more unpredictable than deterrence theory admits, right? So there's a lot of factors there that go into deterrence theory. And so he argues that any study of deterrence must sacrifice the elegance of abstract theory in favor of a more elaborate array of hypotheses based on careful empirical approach, okay? So that really is the approach that we try to take here. Next slide, please. So what we came up with are 10 deterrence factors that could affect the ability of the US to deter China from attacking the United States in the space domain. These are taken from general military balance issues, looking at China specifically, but then also looking at the international norms in the space realm. And so of these 10, as you can see, only 2 are what we judge to have a positive deterrent effect upon China. So let me go through these real quick. Don't want to get too bogged down into it. But the first one is the military balance of power between the US and China in the space domain. Overall, of course, the US has the best military, strongest military in the world. And we also have the best and strongest space program in the world. So we predict that that will have a positive deterrent effect on China. However, the second factor is whether the challenger has an offensive military doctrine. And what we see in the China case is China has an active defense strategy, which has defense in the name, but actually it's very offensive oriented, including preemption and striking first. And when coupled with that, then we have with space being seen as an offense dominant domain, we think that this actually works against deterrence. The third one is ambiguity of intentions to attack in space. And here we see both China and the US have been reticent to talk about what they would actually do if someone attacked their space assets. And China, in fact, still readily denies that it is developing space weapons. So this goes back to our Deterrence 101, where you need that communications or signaling. We think that maybe the lack of signaling in this case maybe goes against deterrence. The fourth is prevalence of uncrewed systems in space, right? It's often said in our field, satellites don't have mothers. We've seen in the air domain and maritime domains where uncrewed systems are more likely to be attacked without escalatory response. We judge that to be maybe also prevalent in the space domain. So again, negative for deterrence. Then we get into more China-specific questions. Here, the challenger dissatisfaction with the status quo and a sense of grievance. And this really is China to a T, right? They are dissatisfied with the international system. They are dissatisfied with the way the U.S., to their perceptions, is trying to keep China out of space. So, again, negative effect on deterrence. And then we have asymmetry in space capabilities between the U.S. and China. Of course, the U.S. is stronger in space. The U.S. PRC maybe has less to lose in space, and so could maybe be incentivized to attack the United States space architecture. On the other hand, China does have a growing dependence on space architecture. And the more that they become invested in space, maybe they will be less likely to engage in catastrophic attacks in space. Number 8 is treating space as a warfighting domain. In this case, China and increasingly the US is looking at treating space as a warfighting domain. And so we would expect that if nations are preparing to go to war, then maybe that will lessen deterrence. Number 9 is weak international norms for space activities, right? We have the Outer Space Treaty, other space treaties, but really there's still a lot you can do in space, and nothing specifically prohibits attacks in space. So again, negative effect. And then finally, reassurance and positive inducements. If you read the academic literature, the best way to prevent a war is to give the rising state what they want, right? But I think at this point in time, we're pretty much past that. There's not much that the U.S. Could give China to make them satisfied, or that would not sort of be, tremendously against U.S. interest. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into the conclusions here. I don't want to take up all of the time here briefing you, but go through some quick conclusions here. One of the conclusions is strategic stability. The condition in which there is no incentive to strike first has not been achieved in outer space. So this would probably be a factor against deterrence. And in fact, the US and China appear to have entered a security dilemma, which is defined as when one state's actions to increase its security are perceived by another state as weakening its security. And so states in a security dilemma are more likely to engage in arms racing and are more likely to enter into armed conflict. And security dilemmas are most intractable when a state's commitments, strategy, and technology leave conflict as the only method to achieve security. And I think we see that in the China case. Another conclusion is that achieving an end state in which the U.S. is so powerful that it dissuades others from attacking in space may be impossible. And so it's probably unlikely that the U.S. will be able to deter the PRC from all attacks on U.S. space assets, right? So especially at the lower end of the escalatory ladder. So especially talking about satellite communications jamming a GPS. Hopefully, the best case scenario is that maybe we could deter China from conducting the most devastating or catastrophic attacks, especially those that produce debris. However, it's speculative, and my own concern is that by China treating space as a warfighting domain, just like any other, we could see a full range of attacks. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, recommendations real quick. Our main recommendation is that we should develop space primarily as a warfighting domain. The primary consideration here is to deny the PRC advantage of a first strike. We need to be able to have a resilient space architecture, so we don't have to depend upon deterrence. We can absorb that first blow, and then we could continue to fight. We need to be able to develop space domain awareness capabilities so we know when China may be wanting to strike, or to be able to determine who the culprit is, or maybe why a malfunction, or maybe why a satellite went out of action. It doesn't necessarily have to be enemy action. It could have been something in the space environment. It could have been a malfunction. And then, of course, we also argue for developing counterspace weapons. We can take a passive approach and sit there and let China blink away at our satellites, or we can actually take a more active approach to threaten Chinese satellites. So we can use both a combination of deterrence by denial through resiliency and space domain awareness, as well as deterrence by punishment to actually degrade China's space capabilities. Next slide, please. I think I pretty much covered it all there, but let me just... finally, I want to say is that we shouldn't leave out developing international norms. I personally have a fairly pessimistic about international norms. China has not been willing to engage with the U.S. on a whole series of strategic issues, but we shouldn't leave it out. And then finally, maybe we should think about some sort of deterrence posture. How do we do the balance between reveal and conceal of space weapons? And do we need some sort of declaratory policy with the use of space weapons? So anyway, I've gone on too long and happy to talk with Chris and the rest of you about our findings.
Great. Well, thanks very much again. So I think in many ways, we have a lot of similar thoughts. One thing I will say, though, I think you were very, very kind, obviously, in your terminology about deterrence being less effective. I would claim that we not only is it less effective, but we don't have space superiority right now, and we don't have space deterrence that is in any way effective or credible in the minds of the Chinese. And the reason why I say that is because in my previous research and writings, as well as operational experience, it seems to me that the Chinese, as you mentioned, have been engaging at the lower intensity or lower threshold of space attacks, whether it be radio frequency jamming or laser dazzling or things of that sort. And as the former Vice Chief of Space Operations, General Thompson, had said, this happens every day. So in a way, it's become, and I hate this phrase, the new normal for everything short of a overt kinetic, strike of sorts. Obviously, there's been demos of that, as you mentioned. Obviously, at the GEO and things of that sort. But I'm just curious what you think is the main piece. I know you mentioned that we need to have more offensive capabilities to be able to have both that denial approach, which it looks like you were listing the list of the DoD's disaggregation and deterrence list from their policy paper from maybe 10 years ago now. But is there anything else that you think would be helpful other than obviously building an actual space force that can wage war in and from space like they're doing?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, I think the big takeaway is exactly right, that we are being attacked in space right now. So the deterrence effort that we're trying to maintain is actually gradually eroding. A lot of the literature and the success of deterrence is based on our experience with nuclear weapons. Right. And so there's a very high threshold for using nuclear weapons. And maybe if we look at deterrence in other domains, right, there's less to lose, right? We're not talking about destruction of the world or destruction of a country's civilization. So actually, the stakes aren't as high as with nuclear war. And so what we see more often than not is that deterrence fails. And actually, if you look in the deterrence literature, there are some conclusions that deterrence theory is actually a failed school of thought, that actually we can't actually depend on deterrence to hold. And so that's why we took the sort of empirical route with the 10 factors. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the idea here is the Space Force should be a warfighting organization. They shouldn't, of course, deterrence is important, but they should primarily focus on developing themselves as a warfighting organization that then they can be used as a element of deterrence within the overall sort of military balance. But if we're hoping to achieve deterrence in space, maybe we're not going to get there. And so we need all of those elements, the resiliency, the space domain awareness, as well as the counter space side. But again, if we're going to go, if we're thinking about deterrence, then we need to think about how do we signal that. And I don't have any easy answers, but space has been traditionally a very secretive part of the U.S. military, and how do we balance that reveal and conceal? What do we reveal to deter, either publicly or non-publicly, to China to make them, change their calculus?
Yeah, I would say one thing that you mentioned in passing was worldview, and I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Dr. Kerry Karchner on strategic culture. And while that's typically aligned more with for all the academics in the audience, what's called constructivism, and I'm more of a realist, I still think there's a lot of utility to that. And in my own writings, in my book, Reversing the Tao and everything, I found that if you want to actually have a credible deterrent, obviously most of the literature, even going back to the old school ones with a rational actor model based, focus on the mind of the adversary. That a deterrent is credible in the mind of the adversary, leader, commander, structure, whatever, depending on how you want to frame it. And I found a lot of value added in reading the credible Chinese literature of what they're thinking in the PLA and their own space forces. And then, of course, reading books such as there was this book by a guy named Nesbitt, I can't remember his first name, called Geography of Thought. And basically, it's a book that talks about how Western thinking is different from the more of a unique way of thinking in the Chinese view of thinking. Just everything from how they view themselves, how they view the world, how they view deterrence, even. And that brings me to the next question. You didn't mention this exactly, but the Chinese, from what everything I've read and seen, has a more unique version of deterrence than, say, the standard Western, more responsive fashion. They seem to be very interested more in a sort of an attack to deter kind of viewpoint than more of a wait to be attacked, be resilient, take a hit, and things of that sort. Is that what you found also in your viewpoint?
Right. So we actually did a report on this a couple of years ago that's also on the CASI website, called China's Coercive Space Activities. And we used the word coercive deliberately instead of deterrence. Because when you look at the Chinese word that is normally translated as deterrence, or wei shi, and you begin to peel back the layers of how Chinese writers characterize wei shi, there are elements of deterrence, but then also of compellence. And so, and taken together, both deterrence and compellence, meaning compellence forcing somebody to do something, those two factors together are coercion. And so and it's a little bit hard to figure out sometimes what Chinese analysts are writing about. It's sort of context dependent. But what we do see is a heavy emphasis on using force to demonstrate an action rather than, or to force an action rather than pure deterrence. So I'll give you an example. So a number of years ago, there was an article written by two officers from what was then the 2nd Artillery Command College, now the Rocket Force. And they were hypothesizing a situation in which the U.S. was providing space-based ISR to Taiwan. And so the scenario was that if that ISR support became critical to Taiwan's defense, what they would do was they would do a kinetic shot against a U.S. ISR satellite to demonstrate to the U.S. that that China is serious about the issue and that we should stop giving them ISR support. So there's but the problem or the concern is that they never think about the second or third order effects or how the U.S. will respond. It's always, more often than not, it's naturally assumed that the U.S. will turn tail, run, or say, oh, yes, we realize our mistake. We're sorry. We will stop doing it.
Right. And I know you mentioned a potential having a new declaratory policy or an improved strategic communications. And that's one of the things that I've seen a lot of that I have a lot of concern with from a policy perspective. I think in the defense space strategy and some of the other documents that have come out of the Pentagon over the last 10 to 15 years, the declaratory policy has been very nebulous and very non-concise to the point where it really doesn't have much impact on any adversary nation. At least whenever I talk to analysts on our side, they're like, yeah, I don't think that really does anything for them. When you say stuff like we reserve the right to respond in a time, place, manner, and domain of our choosing, it's kind of like that. I don't know if anybody who's familiar with the show Red Green from Canada, where they have this thing where they say, well, if I have to, I guess I kind of sort of that's how you make decisions. Um, that's just what it sounds like. We're not really specific, and we're not really showing will, and we're not really demonstrating any capability, which we really don't have a lot of capability, as we see with its current chief of space operations finally saying we don't have enough of what we have, and the stuff that we need we don't have, and things of that sort. So that's important. I agree with that. The other thing I'll mention, when you said if we want to have a deterrence posture with a service that also needs to think of itself as a warfighting service, there are people who think that those are two different mindsets. And if you look at a lot of the way American military establishment has looked at it in the past, at least until the 90s, was that the two were interconnected. So General Power, who was one of the commanders of Strategic Air Command, and also a big advocate of space weapon systems and things for deterrence purposes, he always said that having a robust armed force that's capable of winning, or at the very least doing well enough in a conflict should deterrence fail, is in itself a deterrent. And that also serves as sort of an insurance policy to if all the instruments of power that are being used to try to communicate that deterrent to an adversary or several adversaries is not effective, you still have that insurance policy capable of doing that. And for 20 plus years, we've been trying to be passive and trying to be a good example to, I think, as you mentioned, the adversary nations that we're dealing with now, competitors, whatnot, like China and Russia, have viewed, oh, good, it's a vulnerability, like you said, it's critical infrastructure, it's intertwined into everything we do. So let's go for that, and that's smart on their part. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, like what kind of capabilities do you think we need to deter? Do we think we need to match the ability to escalate equally up the capability ladder, if you will, like the Chinese are looking at doing, everything from reversible to potentially FOBs and space to ground and things of that sort, or something else?
Yes. Yeah. So I guess my, listen, it's just me. I'm just some academic at the Air University talking, right? But I would think there probably would be a place and time for all sorts of different counterspace capabilities up the escalatory ladder. So I think, we would probably want, considering what China has developed, we would probably want some sort of ability to respond in kind. And so then you're looking at developing the full range.
I agree. I've noticed from the way they write about space deterrence and warfighting is that while we like to view it as a tangential thing to terrestrial operations, and we've even seen Space Force literature attempt to redefine space superiority to talk about multi-domain and things of that sort, which I don't agree with because I don't think it matches with reality, but I understand why. But I think that's probably the case. I'm going to go ahead and open up. So if anybody wants to throw in their question into the chat, feel free to do so. We have a couple of them in here, so I'm just going to go to those. I'll start with Chris Basquion. He had a question similar to the one I just asked, but there are some extra additives to it. So feel free to respond. However, he writes, what would be suggested priorities for the Space Force capabilities to establish or reestablish space deterrence, and what budget implications would that be? So would it require a tripling of the budget? What, in your viewpoint, would that be?
Yeah, so I guess I would go back and just say, yeah, I think I would be willing to look at all sorts of the full range of counter space capabilities. What the budgetary impact on that would be, that's probably out of my wheelhouse. So it's space systems are secretive enough, and I'm not an economist or a budget analyst, but suffice to say, if you're adding on capabilities, you probably need an increased budget, but I have no idea how much those extra weapons would cost.
Yeah, I've written an editorial where I say that if they want to get a space force to where they need it to be in the near term, they're going to have to give um, a quarter of the defense budget in order to get, something. And I say that partly because I know that that won't happen, but maybe something more than what they're getting. And even that, because like, oh, we're going to get an additional $10 billion. Whoopee, that's like a recapitalization program for one system. It's not even enough to build out. But that was interesting. The next question here, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and if I'm wrong, apologies. Tong Zhao asks, to achieve the goal of disaggregation, how do you convince China that the United States has actually separated certain capabilities such as tactical and strategic communications? I'm assuming he's talking about systems that have been used for tactical means and not just strategic nuclear means.
Yeah, so this is going to be an issue, even with, let's say, missile early warning, because China has a large conventional missile force. Um, our early warning satellites would be able to pick up both nuclear and conventional missile launches, and China could maybe view it um, as in their interest to take out those early warning satellites, even if there are some nuclear implications to that. So that's one of the things we speculate in the paper is if we're going to have a declaratory policy or at least discussions with the PRC, how do we talk about the integrated nuclear command and control systems that we don't want to be taken out, or do we have a declaratory policy where if you take out our NC3 systems, maybe we'll do the same, but just somehow sensitizing them to the seriousness, to the instability that could cause. Again, deterrence, it's in the eye of the beholder, right? All of this is speculative, but yeah, it's a concern. It's definitely a concern, and so what's concerning to me, and at least one PRC academic, China follows a no first use nuclear policy, right? And whether this is sort of widespread thinking in China, I don't know. It's one data point, right? But this scholar's view was that because China has a no first use policy, if they attacked our space-based NC3 systems, that we would automatically know that this is not a prelude to a nuclear attack because of China's NFU policy. I'm not sure that most people would here in the U.S. would be comforted by that.
No, and I thought I remember reading several times during my own research that isn't there concerns on the Chinese perspective of proactive attack as a deterrent is viewed as self-defense, that yeah, they say no first use, but if they perceive something that we do, even if it's not viewed as aggression on our part, it's viewed on aggression on their part, like shipping a carrier battle group or moving some sort of space system into a position they find to be objectionable, that they could consider that to be the first strike, and their activity would be not a first strike. It would be considered a response. I've seen that in some credible sources, and I guess that could also create some discomfort.
Yeah, so I would say that would mainly apply to the conventional realm. And so that's what I was talking about when I was going through the list of factors was China's active defense strategy, which can be described as politically defensive, operationally offensive. which means that at the strategic level, China will say that it doesn't fight wars of aggression and never has fought wars of aggression and it will not fight wars of aggression, right? So all the wars that China has fought have been defensive wars. But when you start scratching below the surface, what you will see PRC analysts write about is that if there is some sort of strategic move that the U.S. Makes, in your example, movement of aircraft carriers, that this could be thought of as a strategic first shot that then would allow China to conduct first strikes at the operational level. I look at the way that Russia has treated its invasion of Ukraine, right? Ukraine did not attack Russia, but what Russia says is the expansion of NATO was a threat to Russia, and that Russia then had to attack Ukraine. So it's sort of in that sort of vein where Taiwan could maybe go down a certain path or go on for too long as in the state it's in, and that China would view this as a threat.
Yeah, or the examples of the Chinese war with Vietnam and with India and things of that sort, how that whole thing has been perceived by the Western side versus the Chinese side. Interesting. So we have another question here from Peter. Peter says, how about suggesting a rule about what to reveal or conceal and when? And I will just add on, how about having stuff to reveal in the first place? That would actually, create some concern or thoughts in the adversary. So go ahead and answer, and then I have my own thoughts on that question.
Yeah, so that's one of our points is that, and there'll be minds better than mine that will know about the reveal and conceal part. But I think it's something we need to consider is if we need to be able to demonstrate that we have some sort of capability, right? It goes back to the Deterrence 101, capability, will, and signaling. So we have to have that capability, and then we have to make it known in some part. Now, maybe we don't have to reveal everything. Maybe we do it non-publicly instead of publicly. Maybe, we only partially reveal or select systems. But I think there needs to be some sort of movement there that we can say, hey, we have this, we have the ability then to strike at PRC assets. We're doing more on the space domain awareness side. If the Space Force issues its fact sheet every quarter. So they're, you look at that and say, oh, well, isn't that classified? No, it's it's an unclassified form. They're releasing that sort of information to reveal what they know about the space environment. And our suggestion is maybe we should think more about that in regards to the Counterspace side.
Yeah, on my answer to that question is from my experience working in the policy and strategy sphere in the Pentagon and elsewhere. The main reason why we don't have a rule and if of sorts is that our rule has been to not reveal anything, because even if that means revealing that we don't have that much, because they take the uncertainty principle that's important in deterrence theory. And take it into an arena that it never was intended to be by deterrence theorists, and that is almost bluffing to the point where like a hollow bluff. And it's not like all the General LeMays and Powers and Bernard Brodie's and Herman Kahns and all those people that have written on this do not believe in hollow bluffs. They believe in a capable bluff, even if some of them are more on the minimalist approach and some of them are more on the superiority approach. It's still, you need to have some sort of way to communicate that and demonstrate that. And that's what I think the Chinese are doing is they communicate and they demonstrate all their capabilities from various levels. And that shows that they do have the ability to escalate up to areas where we either don't have sufficient numbers of things to do or we are lacking in capability. And a lot of people just want us to continue to stay in that policy sphere where we're restrained to the point of ineffectivity and ineffectiveness, and that's what I think what you're talking about is there needs to be a rule that people will accept. We already do that in other areas like error. So like we reveal that there's a B-21, we reveal that there's a B-2, We don't tell you about every widget it has and every special system it has in order to penetrate air defenses and other things. But we tell you that it can carry conventional or nuclear weapons and it can travel the globe and all that good stuff. And that would be what we would need to do something in space. Hey, this has the ability to maneuver without, its lifespan being depleted. It's able to go between orbits. It's able to strike at targets. It's able to grapple. It's able to do whatever. And you don't have to tell everybody everything, but there still needs to be a criteria. And I know that's been in discussion for a while. But anybody who's ever worked in a government knows that when you try to coordinate that between multiple agencies and departments, unless you have a top-down, shut up and color type of order, somebody always blocks it. So just keep that in mind. So there is policy restraints that need to be released, and hopefully we'll see that happen soon. So while we wait for other questions to come out on the meeting chat, let me just, as we're getting close to the end, a couple of things that I didn't see you mention in your paper from a Chinese capability standpoint, weapons capability standpoint. And I know you did mention space bombardment, but you didn't mention necessarily that the 2021 FOBS test, the fractional orbital bombardment test with the hypersonic glide vehicle and all that good stuff. And then also in recent news, the Chinese have been talking about how they're going to be arming, quote unquote, their space station to help, prevent debris from striking it. And they mentioned Starlink satellites, coming too close to because there's tons of those Starlinks. And I always thought it was kind of funny that, here they are complaining and saying that's the reason why they're going to put a weapon system on their space station, whereas most of the debris that our space station adjusts in its orbit comes from them. So I found that kind of interesting. And a lot of folks on LinkedIn post about those reportings really don't buy that argument. But I was just curious, what are your thoughts on that based on your research for this paper? Would a space-to-ground FOB system being deployed, which I think they are, I mean, obviously, usually when they demonstrate something, they end up deploying it, means, and does that reflect anything upon their space station decision? Does that reflect upon their view of space as well?
Right. Yeah. So we didn't cover the FOBS system in the paper because that's really space to ground, and we were talking, and the paper really is primarily about deterring attacks against U.S. space assets, and so FOBS really is maybe more deals with nuclear deterrence, or at least conventional deterrence. But yeah, I think it's potentially a worrisome system. DIA has been projecting, and they put out an unclassified study about 60 systems by 2035. We'll see if that ever comes around. But so it looks like people are taking that capability seriously. China probably is looking at U.S. missile defense systems and is trying maybe to evade them, but also then it's a way to reach out and touch the U.S. homeland, that it's a way for them to strike facilities right here in the U.S. with little or no warning, both conventionally and nuclear. The defense systems for the space station, a little bit interesting, right? I would, despite China engaging in a number of different plans to build proliferated LEO systems along the lines of Starlink, they are really concerned about the military use of Starlink. And in fact, in the joint statement between China and Russia, when Xi Jinping went to Russia to celebrate the end of World War II here, in May, one of the lines in that joint statement where they had a laundry list of everything they disagreed with the U.S. about was using basically commercial space systems for military use, and that was really a dig at Starlink. They are concerned about its communications ability. They are concerned about its ISR capabilities. I think they're maybe concerned about its Counterspace capabilities. So there's a whole range of issues there that they have concerns about. And considering the incident or non-incident that occurred a few years ago with Starlink satellites supposedly coming close to the space station, maybe they want some sort of defensive measure. But yeah, it's an interesting development. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the old Soviet Union Salyut and Almaz space stations with the chain gun on the front of it, if you remember
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And how when they tried demonstrating it, it almost shook the thing apart. And of course, if they're firing a projectile, you have to know where you're going. Well, great. Well, real quick, before we wrap up here, I just want to ask one more quick question and maybe make a quick comment. So you had mentioned, a pessimism thought that you have on international norm building with the Chinese just based on their behavior. I have a similar view, even though I've worked on such efforts before in previous jobs. But one of the things that I've noticed in some pretty good research, including that book I mentioned by Nesbitt, Geography of Thought, as well as some good studies on Chinese negotiating tactics in business and in governmental circles from Singapore and some other credible places out in the Indo-Pacific region, is that China doesn't negotiate like the West does in the sense of we're searching for a win-win for both sides, whereas they tend to want to come out on top. And being, back in the day, maybe 2011, 2012, one of the big things that would usually be lumped with norms of behavior was transparency. And I know from seeing a lot of their papers and actual statements from the government that they tend to view transparency in business and in government to be a sign of weakness. They don't want to share all their information to show an act of goodwill. That's considered an act of weakness and vulnerability that is not something that really reflects their cultural sensibilities. I was wondering if you looked into any of that in your research with regard to your stuff that you did on this paper.
Right. So I think generally we can say that even though we regard China as the pacing threat, if you read Chinese PLA analysts, they are very much concerned that they're behind the eight ball with the U.S. And so they view very much that transparency is a weapon of the strong against the weak. And so if they reveal too much of their capabilities, they will be hamstrung. Or if they get into an arms control agreement, which is unduly restrictive, it will inhibit their ability to use those asymmetric weapons and tactics that they've been developing and they've been writing about. So I think that's partially why we see really this reluctance to talk about strategic issues, whether it's nuclear, whether it's space. We've done a little bit of talking on AI, but just generally, I think there's this distrust of the U.S. as well as the transparency issue that has really sort of soured both sides then on what could be accomplished through norms or through talking. So I don't think it helps out with stability, but this is sort of the world we live in.
Yeah, I agree. Well, real quick before I say thank you and close up shop for this edition of Real Space Strategy Live, I just want to make an announcement for everybody in case I didn't do it earlier. We do have a live in-person event, not just a virtual event, but this one is an in-person event for those in the DC area coming up soon. We have Dr. Uzi Rubin coming up to the Capitol Hill Club, who will be talking about growing concerns of missile threats, and Dr. Rubin is Israeli, so it's a timely topic for that. For the dates and times of that, just in case things move around, feel free to check our website under events. That's thinkdeterrence.com, and under events, and you'll see that there to make sure that you can have the most up-to-date time and date, as well as the registration link if you haven't registered already. So for now, wanted to say thanks again, Dr. Kevin Pollpeter. Great to have you. Always good to talk with you. Thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you to everybody who attended and submitted questions.
Outstanding. Well, this is Christopher Stone for National Institute for Deterrence Studies, Real Space Strategy Live. Thanks very much and have a great day.